Welcome all. This is Andrea Bartoli. We are delighted to have Christopher Paine today in this interview of megaton to megawatts evaluation that continues. Dr. Paine has been involved, especially at the beginning of the process, and we are delighted that we can have this interview. As in other cases, the interview will be led by Jeffrey Hughes. We will focus on the AC4 CNDSI side on the cooperation and environment aspect, probably at the end or in different conversation. But we are delighted to have this way to go deeper in how the deal came about. Jeff.
Yes. Well, thanks again, Chris, for your time today. As Andrea just mentioned, at Columbia University Climate School, our group AC4 is devoting time to evaluating the megatons to megawatts agreement, which we use interchangeably with the term HEU deal, which was an agreement that was formalized in 1993 and ran until 2013 between the United States and Russia, that took highly enriched uranium from Russian nuclear weapons, diluted it down to be useful for civil reactor fuel that the United States purchased over that period, producing some 10% of US electricity, notably with a little carbon footprint, which made it a particular interest to the climate school. And it was a real sort of plowshare event that few people know about as well as they might. And so we're trying to deepen the historical record of how it came about, how it was implemented, and also what the future implications might be, because there's still a lot of highly enriched uranium left in the world. Chris Paine was a participant in the early steps that made possible the discussions that led to the HEU deal. Chris was a graduate of Harvard in 1974. He then had projects that were involved with Princeton and MIT on arms control, and he made his way to work in the Congress as a staffer to Senator Edward Kennedy, who was on the Armed Services Committee also at the time, where he served for 5 years if memory serves, and then moved over to the National Resources Defense Council, focusing particularly also on nuclear and national security issues. So with that overview of Chris's background, and there'll be links to more detailed information on the website, I would first be particularly interested in, Chris, how did you become interested in the national security field? And I believe early on after your graduation, you were sort of involved in grassroots arms control work that in the United States, which then later branched out also to include Russian counterparts. So with that, I'll turn the floor for you, and we'll see how our conversation unfolds.
Sure. Well, I was in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I've been engaged in sort of international security issues my entire life, since high school, really.
Wow.
And I was a draft resistor, convicted of refusing to comply with the selective service system, served a 2-year probated sentence after college, pardoned by President Carter. And I think I'm probably the only person with my background who ever held a top secret and restricted data clearance. And I think that the juxtaposition of roles explains somewhat how I was able to move in these different worlds and bring to bear popular pressure on the government at the same time as I was operating within the government. So I was after college, I was a left coast journalist in California, covering the military-industrial complex and other sort of progressive issues. And in, I don't know, around 78, the Carter administration proposed a massive deployment of mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles in the Great Basin of Nevada and Utah. And I felt this was such an absurd proposal. It was so cosmically absurd from every possible dimension that I had to go to Washington and fight it. So I left the left coast and went to Washington as a researcher for the Council on Economic Priorities in New York City, and I wrote a book with another guy about the MX missile called Misguided Expenditure, and that took me into an association with the Federation of American Scientists because they needed someone, they needed an analyst and advocate on in that very area. So I was hired by Jeremy Stone at the Federation of American Scientists, and at just that moment, the nuclear freeze movement burst on the scene, and I was at the time dating the woman who founded the freeze, Randy Forsberg. So I worked on the original call to halt the nuclear arms race, and then became the freeze movement's legislative strategist, for better or for worse, and worked on a number of legislative initiatives on the freeze, culminating in the passage of the freeze resolution in the House. And went to work, I guess in 1984 for Representative Markey, who had been a leader of the nuclear freeze. And I became his staff specialist on the Energy Conservation and Power Subcommittee, which had jurisdiction over nuclear nonproliferation issues, which were of great concern to him. He was a kind of leader in the House on both the freeze and nuclear nonproliferation issues.
Right.
And it was there that we carved out a portion of the freeze and decided to focus on just stopping nuclear testing. And that work brought me in contact with a whole host of people within the nuclear weapons laboratories and NRDC. It was through that work that I initially met Tom Cochrane. And so the culmination of that work for Ed Markey was we passed in the House a 1 kiloton threshold cutoff of funding for nuclear weapons tests in 1986, which was an absolute shock. I had devised the legislation, and I have to say most of my comrades in the arms control community believed it had no chance of passage. But what happened in the interim was Gorbachev declared a nuclear test moratorium, and Tom Cochrane was able to negotiate on-site verification for the first time. In the Soviet Union, we managed to place seismometers around the Kazakh Soviet test site in Kazakhstan.
1986, I believe that was.
1986, yes. And so that effort came to fruition just as my amendment, or Markey's amendment, was coming to the floor. And so I was able to set up a display in the speaker's lobby of the House of Representatives for all the members as they passed in through the lobby to vote. They got to see that, in fact, American scientists had accomplished what was supposedly impossible, on-site verification, which was the holy grail of the ostensible U.S. position on arms control, mainly adopted because American policymakers cynically understood that the Soviets would never allow it. So we always insisted on it. But in fact, they did allow it. And this whole effort culminated in the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy, a super hawk named Richard Pearl.
The Prince of Darkness.
The Prince of Darkness, yes, angrily saying to me, you mean there are American scientists running around the Soviet Union and I don't know about it? I said, exactly, yes.
And they're not governmental. They were part of the NGO community.
I said, you refused to do it. So they reached out to us. And anyway, so I went to MIT for a semester, working on articles on a MacArthur Fellowship about the test ban, and then the Democrats took back the Senate, and Kennedy asked me to come work for him on test ban on the Senate side, and so the 1 kiloton threshold ban, we tried for 2 years to pass it on the Senate side, but we weren't able to do it. But we did force, as a compromise in conference, Reagan capitulated and agreed to test ban negotiations with the Soviet Union, but he had this very attenuated track to getting to a test ban. We had to first verify the threshold test ban treaty, and we had to conduct these useless joint verification experiments. They had a whole series of obstacles to get over before the U.S. and Soviet Union could begin actual negotiations on a CTBT. But nonetheless, it started the whole system moving towards ultimately ending nuclear testing. And then while I worked for Kennedy, we passed something called the Nuclear Test Ban Readiness Program, which then forced the Department of Energy to start looking in detail about how we would manage the stockpile under a test ban.
I might just add as background to what you just said. You mentioned the joint verification experiments that would prove somewhat consequential for the HEU deal down the road, because that was the first time future Minister of Atomic Energy of Russia visited the United States, and he it legitimated for the first time the meetings between Los Alamos and Livermore officials and Mikhailov in Nevada, as well as in Kazakhstan, building on the earlier work you mentioned from Velikov and Cochrane.
Right. Well, you have to remember, Mikhailov was present in our negotiations in May of '86 when we negotiated the agreement to do in-country monitoring in Kazakhstan. He was there at the meeting. He was at that time head of the institute that produced test ban monitoring sensors and equipment.
But that was meeting with
Velikov and
Cochrane, et cetera. And but then, because of that sort of catalytic experiment, then that helped lead to the joint verification experiments, which then
it was absolutely an attempt by the Bush administration to take away the Reagan-Bush administration at that point, to take away the baton from us and shift it over into a channel that they felt much more comfortable with, which was, and probably Mikhailov did too, which was, we're somehow going to continue nuclear testing, but it'll be constrained in some way and we'll monitor each other. And yes, you could almost view the JVE as the two nuclear weapons establishments colluding with one another to keep the whole thing going.
Although Mikhailov reflected, or at least as reported by some of the Los Alamos counterparts, that he was saying it's a lot different now, that kind of coming to meet the counterparts that you were targeting, and he was on the targeting committee in the Soviet Union. The personal dimension of meeting his counterparts and kind of having a technical competition about who can measure their tests better, there was a certain rapport building there that may have proved important.
Right. Well, the result of the JVE was that the seismic estimates proved more accurate. In other words, the whole mythology built up about how the direct hydrodynamic measurement of explosions was inherently more accurate than seismology was not correct. So anyway, that's all inside baseball kind of, but these things were fought out. But you have to remember, we got to know Mikhailov pretty well, especially Tom, and Mikhailov was actually, I think, fond of Tom Cochrane. He really liked him, and we liked Mikhailov. He was a blunt, a humorous, good sense of humor, but we knew that actually he didn't agree with us. He was not on the nuclear disarmament track. He was not. And he even published an autobiography called I Am a Hawk.
You're right, I've read it.
It's
expanded, actually. There was an earlier short version, but now it's been embellished to like 600 pages.
Yes, so we're functioning in an environment where we have allies within the Soviet system and then the Russian hierarchy who agree with our perspective on trying to move the world towards nuclear disarmament. And then we're dealing with officials in the weapons complexes on both sides that don't have that vision at all and see it as a threat to their existence. And this is the fundamental problem, in getting to nuclear disarmament, is that the obstacles are more often domestic rather than international.
Your reference there reminds me about the Black Sea experiments starting shortly after the JVE into early 1987. And I believe they were opposed, for example, by the dean of the Las Artemis, the head, his name escapes me momentarily, but nonetheless with Velikov. I'm sorry?
Was it Trutnev that you're thinking of? Anyway.
No,
yeah, the then director
of
Los Artemis,
the then director, he was like, for 50 years, he was the first one to greet Sig Hecker when he came over later in the early 90s. But somehow that experiment was able to go forward despite the opposition of some of the defense establishment in the Soviet Union. And I believe you were on that trip
right.
and I'd just be interested in your recollections about that, because it had congressional folks along, which I suspect you help pick out and
reporters,
perspective, and reporters too. Yeah,
Viktor Karpov was there, the Soviet negotiator, arms control negotiator. Yeah, no, I mean this was sort of the peak of Glasnost, if you will, and the peak of Velikov's influence. Velikov was an extraordinary guy. I don't know if you've read his autobiography, but
yes,
or Frank's
Strawberries from Chernobyl, it's called.
He took extraordinary risks.
Yeah,
he signed that agreement with us without getting clearance from Gorbachev or the Politburo. And he kind of understood where Gorbachev was trying to take the country, and sort of appealed to his good side, and I mean, it was so a lot of the progress that we were able to make was because of personal relationships. I mean, a kind of trust that we were trying to end this ridiculous Cold War and the vastly built arsenals. I don't think most of the Russian participants thought we would get to disarmament within their lifetimes. And I probably didn't either, but we wanted to set the world on a downward trajectory. And as scientists, they understood how irrationally overbuilt the whole structure was and how dangerous it was. Yeah. And that was a common understanding that was, had informed this international scientist movement since, Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, since the founding of Pugwash. There was a community of people in both countries who understood what a menace this all was.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, I always found it interesting that Velikov was sort of able to operate on the fringes of the defense establishment in Soviet Union and Russia, but he himself kind of stayed in the fusion category. He was more free to travel the globe and go to Japan
Yeah.
and go to France and push ITER and so forth. And so he was able to kind of create his own network outside his own system that he could
Well,
leverage.
as Eisenhower says, when you have an insoluble problem like fusion, internationalize it. And Belikov realized that early on that was a way to interact and forge cooperation with scientific communities who could maybe get more funding for their projects if they just were part of this larger international effort.
So, with regard to the Black Sea experiment, do you recall, were you there when like Feder and Cochrane were climbing up the?
Yeah, I took pictures. Yeah,
Oh, good.
and when I had a lot of pictures, and after the whole thing, because we went on that trip, we also visited some other sites, if I recall, or maybe that was
Wasn't it Shari Shagan?
yeah,
That
that's
was later.
Arshtigan and Krasnoyarsk radar, and or was that on I can't remember. That might have been on a trip a little bit later. No, I think it was. I think it was '89, and because I remember coming back and going out to CIA and briefing all the analysts there on what we'd seen.
That's so fascinating. The NGOs are out gathering information.
Yeah, no, we saw facilities that they, of course, had been observing with U-2s and SR-71s and then satellites for decades, but they'd never, and speculating about, but they'd never been to them. And we had, we filled them in. I filled them in on for example, how the Krasnoyarsk radar had come about. It was in the wrong place, and it was oriented outwards, and it was a violation, but it was a hunk of junk. It was falling apart, and that they needn't make such a big deal out of it. It was a symptom of Soviet decay and Soviet backwardness. It was not, a threat.
I suppose part of the motivation for bringing congressional representatives along was to kind of validate what you had just said. And of course, you didn't know in advance, but do you recall? You may not recall offhand who the members were that went, and did it affect their views coming back or their politics?
Well, I remember. Let's see, on the one member, I don't. It's been a long, long time. So,
Sure.
but the member I was closest to that was on the. See, there were two separate trips. There was the original agreement to set up the seismic monitoring network, and then there was the huge conventional calibration explosion that we got the. I believe it was the Soviet Academy, but it must have with the cooperation of the then called Minatom, MAPI, later MAPI. It must have been with their cooperation because they conducted a large chemical explosion that then wound up on the cover of the New York Times Magazine Sunday.
These NGOs exploding things,
and it kind of looked like a small small nuclear detonation. And that was a part of the experimental work to demonstrate that how far you could detect the regional seismic phases from underground detonations, and this was a small explosion by nuclear standards, right? It was maybe 10, I can't remember, 10 tons of high explosive or something like that. I can't remember the exact amount, and on that trip we had Tom Downey, really very committed arms controller from Long Island. He was on that trip, and other. See, I just don't remember who else was on that trip. I could look it up. I'm sure it's in the records of those, in the trip reports and so forth from those, or in the articles that I wrote about them when I came back.
Yeah, but you mentioned the photos that you took as well as some of these records. One of the things that we have on the Columbia website is, besides the archive of interviews to try to further flesh out the details of the historical record, is also archival materials that can be either associated with an individual or just posted for general background with respect to the deal. And so anyway, as you sort through any boxes or move them around and you've come upon a load, we'd be happy to digitize them and post them either with respect to you as an individual or just more generically under the NRDC.
I mean, I do have a lot. I'm just now starting to go through it. Trying. I promised my daughters I would write my own memoirs before I kick off. And, so yeah, they sort of want to know what happened, what their father did before they were born.
I understand the impulse.
So, in terms of the origins of the HU deal, we had been discussed, Frank von Hippel, especially in the context of a fissile material cutoff, which he had been pushing for years and had been part of the nuclear freeze proposal. We were all aware and had discussed at various times with the Russians that, you could easily take HEU from retired weapons and blend it down and make nuclear fuel out of it. You had to convert the metal to oxide, and then you had to blend it with natural uranium. But this was a well-known possibility.
Was this well before the October 1991 meeting?
Oh yes. This had been it had been raised incidentally as a technical possibility for how to deal with HEU coming out of warheads. I mean, it was well understood that this was a possibility. What wasn't well understood, and Tom's genius amalgamation and formulation, was how to integrate this material into the international uranium market without it upsetting the whole apple cart. And the Russian uranium exports were depressing the international market at the time, and it was at a low ebb. And so he was able to advance a proposal that met everybody's needs in theory, in concept. Yeah.
Right.
And also accomplish this fantastic step forward for humanity, getting rid of highly enriched uranium from weapons. So it's how he, because of his expertise in the international uranium market and in enrichment and how the whole process worked, he was able to advance a detailed proposal that one would have thought should have come from the U.S. government. But that's a whole other dimension to this, is that throughout this period, the Reagan, Bush, and then the Bush administrations were absolutely recalcitrant when it came to increasing mutual transparency and accountability. They had used verification for so long as an excuse that by the time it was then possible to achieve some of these goals, they immediately ran the other direction. And the opportunities, the great sadness I have from this period is that despite what we were able to accomplish, it really could have been so much more. We had, through our dialogue and interaction with senior officials like Kozyrev, like Sergei Kortunov, like Velikov, like Mikhailov. I mean, we actually had the early Yeltsin administration making proposals for stockpile disclosures and reciprocal verification that the Bush administration turned a deaf ear to and was actively hostile to. And there's a whole correspondence. Some of it's in the reports from that time. We reprinted it from in the appendices of our corresponding with the Secretary of Energy or Victor Alessi, the head of the DOE Arms Control Office, saying, here we've worked out some technical schemes to do this. We'd like you to take a look at it. Why don't you start a working group with MAPI on this? They're open to it, and nothing. In fact, overt hostility. They basically tried really hard for about a year to keep DOE Weapons Lab personnel from attending our meetings. In fact, not just DOE Weapons Lab, any of the DOE labs, because there were verification programs at Brookhaven and Argonne, and they browbeat the scientists at those institutions not to come to our meetings.
Yeah, I was intrigued looking at the records of the various NRDC FAS meetings with their counterparts. I guess the first one was 1990, and I'm not sure there's a report on that.
There is.
Oh,
there is a report on that meeting. That culminated in a June 1991 report. I think you probably have it in the archive. Ending the production of fissile material for weapons.
Okay, so that joint paper was the record of the meeting, in effect. Okay,
yeah, that's sort of the record of them. There was no sort of, unlike the later reports that really recounted the discussions. This report basically just was a kind of technical summary.
The general observation I was going to make was, besides the admiration of all the detail that you captured, I guess there was a handful of you that you kind of used the notes that somebody orchestrated, but the initial report, it's sort of NGOs with the Soviets, and then over time, by the time you get to the February 1992 report, there's USG people amongst the group, and so
eventually they capitulated.
So without that kind of building blocks where you started, you wouldn't have had some of those later conversations.
Right. I mean, at some point, I believe it was in 92. Certainly by 93, the last meeting that we held, which was that December 93, that was the sixth and last in the series. There were all kinds of government people there. Yeah. But that, again, it coincided with a shift in administrations.
But that struck me too, is that when I looked at the roster of the people that were there in February 1992, a lot of them later moved. Bob Bell was there from the Congress, but then he goes in and heads the arms control in the NSC. There was OMB rep, there was DOD rep, etc. And so
Ken Luongo from Senator Wirth's staff then became an assistant to Hazel O'Leary, Secretary of Energy. No, there was a lot of migration of people who had been in our orbit into the Clinton administration.
Right.
But I have to say, the opportunity was lost. I mean, the Bush administration wasted, essentially 3 years, 89 to 92. Where they could have been forging ahead with setting up a robust verification structure to monitor the dismantlement and disposition of nuclear warheads. And they didn't do it. They just didn't do it. And there was a willingness on the Soviet side to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it was a complicated time with basically Gorbachev almost being removed from office in August 1991, and then your group has sort of been operating there in trying to strengthen.
Well, this gets into you just reminded me of another way we were involved in the early days of the HEU agreement, to the consternation of some people, because we were there the week that the Soviet Union disintegrated.
Right. This would be the December 1991 meeting following the October meeting, which we can maybe circle back to later. But
yeah, well, on the October meeting, all I can say is I didn't know Tom Neff before that point. I'd never met him, and he wasn't on any of the invitation lists for the meeting. I was just looking through the old ones, and he wasn't on the list. Maybe at the last minute he was added. Someone added him. I think Marvin Miller, who was a professor of nuclear engineering in the same department as Tom,
right, at
MIT. Marvin was an attendee at the meeting, and maybe he just suggested to von Hippel to bring him, but he wasn't on our radar, for that meeting.
Well, of course, von Hippel knew Neff from graduate school days, and I think Tom may have shared his draft op-ed with
him. I never heard that backstory. I don't know how it happened, but yeah. So, and Tom didn't give a presentation, if I recall, at that meeting. He just was able to talk to Mikhailov and maybe some other officials, and then his op-ed appeared a few days later, and that started the ball rolling.
Right.
Because if you look at this period, it's just extraordinarily crammed with events. I mean, Cochrane, I looked at it, somewhere in my files, I came across his travel schedule for, October, November, December of that year. And I mean, he was at a pugwash meeting in Italy, then he came back to the US, then he went to Russia, then he came back, and then he went, then he went to China. We were constantly in motion during that whole period. In fact, we had a group of Chinese scientists as observers at the October
meeting. Yeah, I was struck by that. That was interesting.
And we had private meetings with them afterwards at NRDC. And then we had in later years substantial exchanges with them on test ban issues. I took Ray Kidder and Dick Garwin, Tom, Robert Norris, and I went to China, I could believe in '93, and met with some of their nuclear weapons team and discussed what the Chinese were going to do in response to, the U.S. Congress's decision to halt nuclear testing, and then Russia's willingness to sign the CTBT. So yes, so we were. It's extraordinary. I mean, I'm just looking here. We had the parallel unilateral initiatives were announced, the Bush-Gorbachev initiatives of September 27th and October 5th, 91. And then we had our workshop at the Plaza Hotel just a few days after that. And then they formed in December 8th of December, they formed the CIS. So the Soviet Union is history. Right. And then we arrive on the 14th in Moscow. So we're there, basically that first week of independence. And what I think is not recorded in the account of that meeting is that Cochrane and I had a meeting, and wasn't official. We went back to the parliament one of those evenings. We were in Kiev and met with the chair of, I believe it was their defense committee at the time, but could have been their foreign relations committee. It was one of those two committee chairmen. And Tom sketched out on the back of an envelope what the HEU value of the warheads were that Russia was withdrawing from Ukraine. And we believe that's when the Ukrainian policy establishment realized that the Russians were absconding with something of great value that they were entitled to, a portion of. Yeah. And of course, that led to some complications down the road.
Right.
But I believe we are, for better or for worse, responsible for that. And we felt for better because the U.S. policy toward Ukraine, but the Bush administration policy was completely tone deaf. It was completely off the rails in the wrong direction. It was so pro-Russian, so pro-Soviet, and no historical understanding of the relationship between Greater Russia and Ukraine. Just no background in it at all, and so there was no help going to Ukraine. It was all going to Russia. The agricultural credits and so forth, the food, emergency food shipments, all that. It was going to Russia. They didn't care about Ukraine. And Bush actually, at some point, landed in, I can't remember when he gave his speech there, but he landed there and gave an absolutely idiotic speech, which was completely panned by the body politic in Ukraine. They considered it offensive because it was so tone deaf and so pro-Soviet. So we felt like Ukraine was getting the short end of the straw here, and that we needed to do something to at least make them aware that they were entitled to some of the revenue from this, and we did.
Yeah. I was going to say that in January 1992, Baker met with Yeltsin to set up the February 1992 Camp David first summit between Yeltsin and Bush 41.
Mm-hmm.
and Velikov had already set up a meeting with Yeltsin of all the Artemis 16 C-70 folks, the kind of the scientists that would and Gorbachev having lost the launch codes in August, it's a good opportunity to meet with the nuclear weapons establishment. And I think he basically got blessing at that meeting, according to accounts of it, that to go commercial, and the whole idea of selling uranium or plutonium came up. And so when in February 92, when Yeltsin meets with Bush, who's with him? Velikov. And Velikov, in the now declassified records of the meeting, kind of makes the pitch for the HEU and plutonium sales. Yeah. And
he actually included plutonium in that?
Both, yep.
They were pushing the sale of weapons plutonium for MOX fuel.
It was on the table, and Cheney objected. Well, we have enough HEU. He didn't want the Defense Department to be on the hook to buy it. But then Scowcroft had already been briefed by Velikov and said, Dick, there's companies that want to buy it. You can blend it down. And so the reason I raised this came to mind was that within a week or so, Baker was on a plane to Moscow to meet with Kozyrev on that idea of the deal. And you mentioned Cochrane's travel schedule. He was then flying to all the other new constituent parts of the CIS, trying to set up embassies simultaneously in all of them and trying to keep one successor nuclear state. You mentioned pro-Russians. I was just there was a counter case that we're trying to keep one nuclear power as opposed to four. And so I think that was
that was the tension, obviously. But the way it was done, I mean, of course you have three entities involved at this point. You have the CIS, and under their agreement, there was supposed to be a unified command, and the transportation and disposition of warheads was supposed to be a sort of joint project. But the Russians just took it over. and ignored all the other participants.
Right.
And had the U.S. intervened at that point and said, yes, we're genuinely interested in monitoring and transparency, and here's what we're willing to do if you guys are willing to do it, and all the republics would have supported us, and we would have had the Russians over a barrel in terms of transparency at that point. But we didn't. We didn't volunteer anything, not a single thing. And yeah, it was all framed as, well, verification could be really clumsy and onerous, and it would delay the process, and we don't want to delay the process. They clearly had not thought strategically about trying to shape the world that they were suddenly getting. They decided that sort of a Russian monopoly on nuclear power, basically continuing the status quo, the bipolarity between Russia and the United States, was the only model they knew, and they gravitated towards that. They didn't rethink the nature of the security system or the global future at all. They just slid into this. The U.S. was going to inherit the mantle. Very little changed in the U.S. as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Very little changed within our military-industrial complex. You know, there was a chain of acquisitions ensued, as there was a temporary cutback in the defense budget, but that only lasted 2 years. But that prompted some consolidations and acquisitions in the defense sector, and then a group of Bush officials with foreknowledge of those plans left and founded a venture capital firm and made billions with their proprietary knowledge of how the defense industry was going to be restructured. But that's sort of the level at which they were functioning. They weren't thinking about, to his credit, the old Cold Warrior Paul Nitze, as soon as he realized that Russia was disintegrating, he said, we don't need nuclear weapons anymore. We should denuke. And he wrote a paper with Les Aspin, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, advocating a policy of denuking, as he called it, and getting to the lowest level possible in as quick a time as we could. And that was the right policy response, but the Bush administration was not on board any of that, unfortunately.
Your comments remind me that there was a congressional role in all of Bush policy here. I think it was in November of '91 that the initial debate on Nunn-Lugar came up, and it was shot down. And I was intrigued, putting together my book about the deal, to actually see that in parallel, there was Senator Pell was sponsoring legislation to federally fund the HEU deal, and Neff and von Hippel wrote on its behalf. But basically, there wasn't enough room even to get Nunn-Lugar through, let alone two federally funded initiatives, because there was kind of where's the Cold War budget payoff.
What happened was Democratic.
So
Thornburg lost to Wofford, and that spooked the Bush administration, that a moderate Republican like Thornburg would lose to a Democrat, and Wofford had run a kind of anti-foreign aid. He'd run a misguided campaign, in my opinion. He had focused on, the Bush administration we were entering a recession, and he had focused on foreign aid as a waste, and that we should be supporting Americans and meeting their needs, which of course we should have been, but they're not mutually exclusive. It was the way we were spending our money, and the easiest thing to do at that time was simply to take a chunk of the defense budget, just reorient $1 billion for defense, and this is obviously controlling and reducing the nuclear weapons stockpile in a disintegrating Soviet Union is obviously a national security issue. And they could have diverted money from the defense budget. They did divert a small amount for transportation, for airlift and things like that. But they didn't use the resources of the Department of Defense to significantly assist the Soviet Union in its hour of need, and then Russia.
Well, not while Cheney was there.
Yeah.
He kind of, but it was tough to get Nunn-Lugar even through to kind of. I guess there was a certain logic.
It was. Yeah, no, it was. The political environment was sort of hostile to it, and there, even George Mitchell, I think,
former
senator from Maine,
leader,
who was majority leader at the time, was criticizing, or was he ranking minority leader? I can't remember when the changeover occurred, but he was making noises about how the Bush administration was ignoring domestic policy and was, too preoccupied with international affairs, because we'd just done the Gulf War, and all this international coalition building that Bush was involved in. Anyway, yeah, no, and then when it was resurrected, and that's where our seminar came in, the October 91 meeting, was that we brought Mikhailov and other. He initially had proposed a much bigger delegation of people. I mean, he sent us a huge list, mostly scientists from his labs, from Artemis and Chelyabinsk 70, and he wanted to have a meeting was going to be a technical meeting on how to verify warhead dismantlement. That was what Mikhailov initially thought he was getting into, because Cochrane had gone over there in June, and come back with an agreement between himself and Mikhailov to conduct a joint study of nuclear warhead dismantlement.
That's initiative.
Yeah, no, and there he was, and Tom came back with an agreement, and then Mikhailov sent in this list of people, and in the interim, the focus in the meeting shifted to, because of the political situation in the Soviet Union, and then the coup, it shifted to more of a sort of broad brush focus, a bigger lens. But
I was going to say, who had the initiative also to include taking Mikhailov down to the Congress?
Oh, well, that was my doing, because I had, when I knew this meeting was happening, I wrote a memo to Kennedy, and I said, we've got these guys coming, and maybe you should have an issue dinner, and we'll get. Kennedy typically had these dinners out at his house every couple of months, and he'd pick an issue that he wanted to make headway on, and it was very bipartisan. He'd invite Ted Stevens and Senator Warner of Virginia, and some of his Republican friends, and some Democrats, and some experts, and we'd all sit around the table and try to get some bipartisan headway on something.
Did he ever invite Domenici?
I think probably at some point I'm sure Domenici must have come to one of those meetings over the years, but nothing involving this. Okay. So what happened was he didn't go. He in the end he couldn't do the issue dinner, but he agreed to a meeting. He invited Mikhailov to his hideaway office in the Capitol, and so on the appointed day, this was after our workshop. They were in town for like another 4 days, and I had suggested that to Kennedy that they have an issue dinner, and that maybe he could take Mikhailov and organize a meeting with the Arms Control Observer Group, which was a bipartisan, very bipartisan body by design that was the sort of Senate's visiting committee to the arms control negotiations, so that the administration wouldn't get off on completely the wrong track when it came to bring a treaty to the Senate. They would have had a lot of prior consultation with these interested senators who knew something about arms control. So Kennedy, I guess, in the end, we resolved that I would bring Mikhailov up to his hideaway in the Capitol and meet with a group of senators. And so at the appointed hour, I go to the hotel to pick up Mikhailov, and he's not there.
Oh, no.
And I said, where is he? And one of his aides or somebody knew that he was nearby shopping for shoes. So I piled back in the cab and went to the store. And yeah, he was in there shopping for shoes, and we had to haul him out. He's carrying these shoes.
Were they Gucci's?
Well, they were expensive. I think they were pretty. He was jumped at the chance to buy Western shoes, right? And then we went to the Capitol and had the meeting. And Bingaman was there. Senator Bingaman from New Mexico was there, and Senator Warner, Ted Stevens,
wow,
who was the chairman of Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, or the ranking minority member, because I'm no longer clear on when the power shifted. And then Stevens invited him to perhaps most likely prearrange with Kennedy to the Arms Control Observer Group. So I think the next day he went by, he swung by the Arms Control Observer Group and gave them the pitch for the plutonium storage facility. Mm-hmm. The pitch for storing, they wanted to use the Nunn-Lugar money, which wasn't available yet, but it was in the air, and the amounts were sort of known, and he wanted to use the entire amount, the $400 million. Well, then it was $500 million. He wanted to use $400 million for the plutonium component storage facility, and he wanted $100 million as a kind of slush fund to spread around the local area, and probably to local politicians, and build good works like playgrounds and schools. And I thought that was reasonable, because that's how it's done even in the U.S. The DOE routinely does that when it builds facilities. Los Alamos does it all the time.
It was kind of similar to the idea later that Cochrane would be involved in with Admiral DeMars and Judge Webster, the trust, the nonproliferation trust. It was nonproliferation was the core, but you had these other social needs to serve as well.
Yeah, well, maybe, although that's it came a bit later.
Yeah,
but no, this one was, and then that ran afoul. Nunn told Mikhailov, "Oh, that's not going to work, because people won't accept that you have those kind of community impact funds when we don't have them available in the U.S. budget here."
Was Nunn at
we can't spend that kind of community impact assistance in Russia if we can't even come up with the money domestically, which was more a commentary on the U.S. problems in the U.S. political process. I mean, Mikhailov correctly apprehended that was a smart thing to do, and I also think he was creating a pool of relatively unaccountable money that then could be siphoned off by various people. Yeah.
Was Senator Nunn at the observers group, or was that a separate meeting at his office? Or
well, I wasn't in the room, so I can't tell. I don't remember if Senator Nunn was there. I expect he probably was.
He was quoted in the newspaper by Oberdorfer about what Mikhailov told him, "I need your help," stuff. So I was just
so it may have been on a one-on-one meeting, or it was at that meeting. I don't know. I think I just don't know.
So you were ferrying him around and trying to keep him in control from running?
Yeah, well, just trying to do my job. I felt that was we had the sense of the time was, at least among progressives, was this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. The Cold War, the absolutely impermeable structure that had been built up was crumbling, and and represented a tremendous opportunity to move forward on a whole range of fronts, and yeah, so we were going to do everything we could to, and plus these Russians were our friends at that point. We were trying to help them as individuals. Yeah, I mean, we wanted the lab guys that we knew not to have to go out and farm potatoes for a living. They were accomplished scientists. They deserved something better. Yeah.
Well, that was in the back of my mind when
a couple of points that in the conversation came that I would like to address, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One exactly on this idea, right? That there is something ending, that you have a sense that this irrationality of the buildup. You mentioned it before that even on the Soviet side, there was this sense that this extraordinary number of nukes, this extraordinary system was just irrational and wrong. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, I think that was, that was a shared perception that, and the Russians felt it more acutely than we did as a society, because the military-industrial complex there had cost them civilian prosperity. It had bankrupted their country. And the general attitude in the Bush administration was, yeah, tough luck. We're so productive, we could have guns and butter, but too bad you only had to have guns, and now you can't afford guns. So in one of the reports, I think it was the report on the 4th, I don't remember which one.
Is that in February 92 or is it in late?
The February 92 meeting. I analyze, there was a presentation by Bill Sutcliffe from Livermore, scientist at Livermore, on the lab's weapons conversion plan, or its economic conversion plan, and how it was trying to reduce dependence on income streams from the government for nuclear weapons. And I analyzed, he gave a kind of rosy presentation, and then I analyzed his figures, and I was able to show that, in fact, conversion at the labs had been a total failure. and I included that analysis in the report, saying, the Russians aren't the only ones who need help restructuring, because it's been a total failure at the labs to do that. And even though it's been pursued for many years, they had failed to establish a valid, commercial relationships that could support groups of researchers. And so
the other point that I was intrigued is this idea that it was well known how downblending could be done and how the electricity was to be produced. And is that published in regular scientific journals? Is something that was preview of some scientists, or was just well known by everybody?
It was well known by everybody, and I see it's mentioned occasionally in reports, from early on, that you have to convert the metal to oxide and then blend it down, and that was a pretty straightforward technical step that was known to everybody. Yeah.
But it was not done prior.
Not to my knowledge.
There is an Italian claim that Edoardo Amaldi was involved in imagining this and explaining it. So it's another line of inquiry. But
right. I think you could look back and probably find in the annals of the Pugwash groups, when they discussed disarmament, I'm sure this was raised as a possibility. The scientists and the Italians, of course, were very active in Pugwash, so they may have raised it.
Definitely, including Amaldi and so on. So that would make perfect sense that Pugwash could be the place. But there is another element then on this conversation with Tom and so on. There is certainly this element of the uranium market and so on, but especially in this idea of the system crumbling, right? This nuclear system that, especially in the Soviet Union, is extraordinarily costly and so on, is that the suggestion is actually pivoting into something that makes nuclear fissile material worthy. So you have suddenly something that was so burdensome and costly and so on that suddenly becomes something that you can make money out of it.
Right, exactly.
So it's a fundamental shift and reorientation of the entire production line, right?
No, I mean it was all credit to Tom for putting the thing together, because it was the magic bullet. I mean, when you think of the fact that the U.S. enrichment plants at Portsmouth and Paducah ran on TVA power, mostly coal generated, overwhelmingly coal generated. The climate benefit of avoiding those electricity costs and using the SWU value of Russian HEU, it just makes sense, much less the bill for the electricity, but just the climate benefit from shutting down all that coal generation. No, it was a brilliant idea, and the way he put it together and explained it, where everybody's interests could be met.
And this is one of the pieces that we are going to do with the climate school more, to understand better, the environmental outcome, what is going to be the result of this, even though it was not necessarily the reason for this to happen. So next year we will invite you again. We will focus on this outcome.
Well, no. I mean, I just note that in passing, because I have to tell you that, as I say, I was intensely involved in the early stages of this in 1991 and into early 1992. But after that, I became totally preoccupied with getting test ban legislation through the Congress, and then in the negotiation, once Clinton came in, then negotiations on the CTBT, and I started doing what Cochrane was doing, running around the world, visiting nuclear weapons programs in France and China and Pakistan and India, and trying to get them all to sign on to the CTBT. So,
well, that was certainly very worthwhile and very important. So,
yeah.
But because now megaton to megawatts is over, then we can go back and say, well, the impact on the environment was significant in this and this and this. And so I really hope that you will engage in that conversation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the avoided electricity costs and the avoided emissions are certainly, it's an obvious benefit. And then if you look at the local contamination at these enrichment plants, at the gaseous diffusion plants, probably not operating them, and the waste reduction involved in not operating them was another environmental benefit. Yeah. And then, of course, the avoided emissions, whatever, had we not gotten the fuel, which at one point, you have this data better than me, was like a fifth of all U.S. electricity generation, something like that, was coming from Russia. Yeah.
And then, of course, less mining, less storage, less safeguarding, you have a lot of indirect advantages. But
yes. Well, I would just want to say that just reminds me, less mining. Of course, there was the other side of this equation that stalled the agreement implementation for 3 years.
The suspension agreement.
Yeah, was a bunch of uranium miners, and the way that the tail could wag the dog, something so important for humanity, could be wagged and distorted by a small domestic uranium mining industry is extraordinary.
Yeah. But then they were able to figure out a solution, and there is an interesting cooperation component there. So we are going to speak about this now in June. One thing, a last point that I'm very intrigued by is this freedom of the NGO. That is to say, you are able to do a lot of things exactly because, in a way, you don't have a mandate. And yet you are able to engage and dream or allowed for things to happen in a way that then the government is able to follow. And I find this peculiar in many ways, but very interesting in this particular case.
Well, I mean, I think that's the whole premise behind, the original Pugwash movement and the NGOs that followed it, like NRDC and FAS. Actually, FAS was created before Pugwash. Yeah, I mean, you have to believe. I mean, we certainly believed that it's useful and important for scientists and other intellectuals in countries that are otherwise at cross purposes to meet with each other and discuss and try to find solutions. That doesn't seem to be the premise anymore. But I think it was the sort of imminence and overwhelming nature of the nuclear threat that really caused the governments to at least allow these contacts. I mean, we had to fight for some of these contacts. When we tried to bring Russian scientists initially to the Nevada test site, when we set up a seismic network very similar to what we had in the Soviet Union, the Reagan administration tried to block. Actually, it was the Reagan administration and then the Bush administration tried to block our efforts. They tried to deny the visas, and it was only through personal contacts between the chairman of NRDC and a guy named Whitehead, who was the Undersecretary of State at the time in the Bush administration, that we in 1989 that we got the visas.
Kind of tacit assent,
consent. It's just one Wall Street lawyer to another. Come on, be reasonable. I mean, these people are doing good work. Let them come. And we were able to offset the ideologues in the Department of Defense.
On this last point you raised, Andrea, I think there was an analog with NGOs with the outreach that was able to be engineered at the beginning of the Clinton administration between the U.S. national labs and Manhattan, that they were willing to let Los Alamos or Livermore representatives, which are nominally government contractors, to go make agreements with Manhattan sites to do work at their sites that took it out of the realm of government to government, and it was able to kind of go forward in a way that
you're speaking of the lab to lab program, right?
Lab to lab, which was in many dimensions, from trying to bolster science to try to bolster specific physical material security on sites, and it was interesting how that cooperation really spanned out in the early Clinton administration, that kind of was able to reframe relations with Yeltsin and Russia about what type of cooperation was possible, at least in the nuclear realm, from Nunn-Lugar to lab to HEU deal to efforts on plutonium disposition.
And then we got to the cooperative threat reduction program, right? So I mean, there was yes, a progression. I have to say, in retrospect, this is my memory, and you're much more of an authority than I am now on this. But I don't think the Nunn-Lugar program, the original Nunn-Lugar program, was very effective. It didn't deliver it was going to deliver rail cars and canisters for warheads. But basically, all that happened before any of the aid got there, and I think we delivered Kevlar blankets. So it didn't actually, because of the way the slow pace at which the U.S. government works, the aid never really arrived to be timely and helpful. It came later. Some aid came later. Yeah.
Yeah, but certainly the lab to lab work and was important. What Jeff was saying was definitely.
Yes, it was important, but I mean, what kind of lasting political change did it lead to? This is my whole point: is that there was a moment when all the deck of cards have been tossed up in the air, and they were still floating down. And
Yeah,
every year that went
another order
by,
could have been possible. Another way could have been possible, and your point is very clearly made, that it could have been a very different world.
well, I'm also saying that the forms of cooperation that were adopted were designed to actually reinforce the status quo. For example, the problem in Russia was the lopsided influence of the military-industrial complex vis-a-vis civilian society and the parliament, the nascent parliament. And we had a sort of struggling democracy, to put it mildly. And so the major form of cooperation becomes cooperation between weapons labs. I mean, I'm sorry, but I don't mean to sound too cynical or conspiratorial, but there was an agenda there. There was clearly an agenda that this allowed particularly the DOE weapons complex to control the nature of the interaction with the Russian side. It would have been better had those.
Some would argue that was wise, right? Power comes first, and then the rest will follow.
But what was wise about it? I mean, what did we get out of it ultimately? In fact, by early 2000s, Putin was giving speeches at the weapons complex, promising their complete and full regeneration. I have some of those speeches.
Yeah, sure.
So. And on the U.S. side, what was done during the Clinton administration, basically at the behest of and under severe pressure from the nuclear weapons complex and all its associated contractors, was to basically tell the Russians, we're not stopping. We're not stopping weapons modernization. We're going to do it without nuclear weapons tests. And we launched a huge program to achieve those goals. And of course, the Russians couldn't afford anything like those programs in the mid-90s. But by the mid-90s, we were spending billions on stockpile stewardship and management, as it was called. Science-based stockpile stewardship.
But that program, in its defense, it did enable the U.S. to sign on to the CTBT, and it was going to be able to prove out.
When you say, do you mean technically enable or do you mean politically enable?
It was going to try to replace the argument for why you needed to have underground nuclear testing by having virtual testing, which.
But that argument was false, and that was the reason we were able to pass the nuclear testing legislation that we did, and ultimately the Congress forced the Bush administration to stop testing. Because
I'm talking about under Clinton.
No, I'm speaking directly to your argument. This is the common misconception that those programs, on a technical basis, allowed the United States to enter into a test ban. And everything that I learned in the classified realm while I was in government convinced me of exactly the opposite, that those were political handouts to the laboratories to get them to at least stand aside and not actively oppose a CTBT. It had nothing to do with what was really needed in order to certify the nuclear weapons stockpile indefinitely into the future. That's a whole different debate, and one that I engaged in ad nauseum for years, along with some of my scientist friends at the labs. And we fought that out in classified fora for years. And ultimately, the Congress bought our understanding of the issue.
But that's
why we stopped testing.
But the program that was started then is what certifies the stockpile today without underground testing.
No. I mean, you can say that. That's what the labs will tell you. But the more appropriate question is, was that program even necessary at the scale? Why is it necessary to do cutting-edge nuclear weapons research in order to maintain a known stockpile of known nuclear weapons designs that have already been tested? That's the question. And the answer we came up with, in the classified fora was, it's not necessary. And this was acknowledged by my friends on the inside in the Clinton administration. This was the political sop that the administration felt it had, the Clinton administration felt it had to pay in order to get the labs to at least stand aside. In the end, they damned the test ban with faint praise. They did not fulfill their commitments. They actually torpedoed the Senate ratification of the test ban by saying that they could not indefinitely certify the stockpile under a CTBT. They would not sign up to that, even with all this money.
Jeff, it's up to you.
Yeah.
But if I could just briefly, you mentioned a meeting that wasn't on the record that you had in the Soviet Union. I thought I'd read by an account by Halfmeister, who was at
Dave Halfmeister.
Some memoirs that he had on his Cal Polytech site that he'd referenced. I think it was Harold Agnew and Carson Mark perhaps going to the December meeting. I don't know if I don't know if they were left off for.
No, they were there. They're on the list. I have that report. And they're on the list as attendees. Yeah.
Was that for the December meetings when the?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Harold was there.
So former head of Los Alamos, and then Carson Mark, who was the head of the
theoretical
division at Los Alamos for decades. So yeah, it was quite a. And I guess Ted Taylor was there too. You mentioned we were talking about the downblending.
Well,
was he a contributor to these discussions actively, or he was very imaginative?
I mean, did he give a presentation at that meeting?
I don't think he gave a formal presentation, but
no. He did give a presentation later about disposing of plutonium in the sun, shooting it into the sun. Ted was kind of a wild and crazy guy, wonderful guy.
The biggest fission and smallest fission explosions.
Yeah. And Agnew and Carson Mark had a discussion with the Russians about how to inert the nuclear weapons primaries so that they would become useless. I mean, you could just, it would involve using the tritium feed tube into the primary to insert some kind of neutron absorbing gooey substance that sort of would block the implosion, disturb the implosion, and make it useless for anyone who could steal a plutonium pit.
So pretty serious technical discussions in this NRDC forum.
And when you see Harold Agnew talking to General Zelentsov or whatever, head of the 12th Main Directorate, in the Soviet defense forces that control nuclear weapons, you think this is a new world. We can actually go somewhere with this, and but then I look back and I look at the endless number of letters we got from the Bush administration rejecting every suggestion that we made, pointing out that I got legislation through the Congress, not through the Congress, I got it introduced, favoring nuclear weapons declarations and declarations of fissile material inventories and so forth. And then I used that model legislation. I took it to Russia. And a couple of months later, Kozyrev went to Geneva and proposed the legislation, my legislation. He said, this is what we're willing to do. And he used my legislation as a model. And nothing, no one responded to that from the Bush administration. Nobody said, oh, Kozyrev's just given this speech that's kind of important, He's talking about accepting declarations and inspections that have never been possible before. So, my lasting impression of this period is that the best thing that came out of it was the HEU agreement. That was the sort of concrete practical step forward. But what could have come out of it, that's a book I may write someday in the future.
Indeed. Go ahead. We are eager to read it. So, but thank you. This is great.
Yeah.
Well, even if it's not an entire book, if there have recollections that you wish to have posted next to your name on this archival site,
Sure.
Smaller versions of it, and we can take them down and update them as
I think
appropriate as well.
Most of the kind of categorical, first of all, the harassment we experienced when we tried to, when we organized these meetings and invited lab personnel who wanted to attend, and then they were informed by their superiors at DOE that they couldn't because we were, quote, ahead of official policy on this issue. That was a cudgel that they used that kept a lot of lab participants away. We would have many more people come to these meetings had they been allowed to. And,
I saw that.
Yeah, and it
would take the prerogative of the president was the claim.
Yeah, the DOE said that we were usurping the prerogative of the president, but unfortunately, the Bush administration policy was, which had been laid down in the late Reagan administration and just continued over, was that we didn't need verification anymore. This is after 4 decades of insisting that it was the sine qua non of arms control, and then suddenly we didn't need it. So you can draw your own conclusions about the degree of cynicism behind that.
What happened to trust but verify?
Yeah. Exactly. And especially when the Russians were for the first time really open to it. Yeah.
One thing your experience reminds me of, you mentioned building trust with your Russian counterparts. Mm-hmm. And I remember a professor of mine was involved in conflict resolution, Robert North at Stanford. He mentioned meeting with Greeks and Cypriots for a week to try to work out their differences, and they could kind of come to an understanding, good ideas on how to cooperate, but how do you sell them back home? And so to some extent, your experience over those years of meetings builds the trust with Kozarov and to present your ideas, whereas the landing in the less trusting domestic structures, institutions, and politics is part of the challenge of making it work. And the market approach of the HEU deal made it easier.
I mean, the market, although you have to, the market approach, I mean, I'm not a student of all the permutations that then happened in the HEU deal, but I do know something about USEC, and not competing that contract was a mistake. It should have been openly, the agent contract should have been openly competed, because I think there were more competent companies than USEC. They were just using the agreement as a way to finance their privatization.
I think I was curious, the original legislation was 92 to created USEC going forward in anticipation of the HEU deal that would have USEC be able to transition to a more environmental friendly technology, AVLIS or centrifuges. And I think Domenici later changed that to enable potential competition, but it wasn't exercised as you suggested.
No, I mean, Babcock and Wilcox came to our office and laid out what they were prepared to do. And I just remember being reasonably impressed. They were very competent, technically much more competent organization in this area, since they dealt with HEU for the Navy.
Mikhailov visited their facility, I believe, in Irwin, Tennessee.
I didn't know that. Yeah. And even now, I mean, USEC and then goes through a bankruptcy and reemerges as this other company,
Centris.
Centris, yeah, and they're trying to resurrect this old Oak Ridge gigantic centrifuge technology, colossal centrifuge technology. I remember opposing this back in the 70s or early 80s, and saying, what's wrong with this sort of run-of-the-mill it's a commoditized business now, uranium enrichment.
Right.
You don't need some gigantic innovative thing. Just
Abercrombie and Fitch versus
license
Hallmark.
Urenco's design if you want centrifuges, and let's get on with it. But that was, and they're still doing it. And now, I mean, if you look at this, what's going on now compared to the sort of our perspective then. For example, we thought no one thought it was acceptable to have plutonium metal in commercial use and distributed plutonium metal, weapons grade plutonium metal distributed to commercial users. That's what the Trump administration is doing right as we speak. There's a cooperative program between a small company and Los Alamos to use weapons grade PU in reactors. Just craziness.
Well, you've got a new job to do.
No, I'm done. I'm done. But I just I mean, history does move in cycles, and we've taken so many steps back from where we were, in the early 90s. I mean, think about, Kennedy had a budget plan. I've forgotten what he called the peace dividend, and how we were going to reshape the defense budget and all this money that was going to be going into human needs. And Nitze was talking about denuking and wrote that paper with Aspen, and somehow these good ideas were basically undone over the course of and sabotaged over the course of the Clinton administration. Yeah. And then they met their death when Bush came in and said, for the next arms control agreement, we don't need any verification at all. It's just going to be, mutual declarations.
Your appreciation of megaton to megawatts is very clear. We are very grateful for these words and your comments.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we'll be getting back to you as discussed before with this record of our discussion, and we'll proceed from there.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.